right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Fearcast. This is the podcast dedicated to OCD, anxiety spectrum disorders, and getting your life back. I'm your host, Kevin Foss, and I'm a licensed clinician specializing in OCD and anxiety. To no surprise, right? Well, thank you all for joining me for this, what is typically a question and answer based podcast. To ask a question for a future episode, go over to fearcastpodcast.com and you can go to the submit a question link and send me a message. You can also, again, send me an audio message. If you record your message and send it to me at questions@fearcastpodcast.com or add it to a Google Doc, a shared Google Doc or something to that effect, and go and send me the link through the submit a question link at Fearcast Podcast. I will read it, consider it, and put it up on a future episode. However, today is going to be a little bit different. I know I keep saying that. So for this episode, I had the honor of having Mitzi VanCleve on to talk about religious scrupulosity within the context of Christmas time. So at the time of this recording, we're just getting into the Christmas season. It's the first half of December, and it was recommended to me by a listener that, hey, have you ever done an episode on how to deal with Christmas as someone with scrupulosity? I said, you know what? No, I haven't. And now we are. So Mitzi was so kind to jump onto this episode to talk about a little bit of her experience, and also she and I had a great chat about different ways that one can think about Christmas, one can approach Christmas time, and different tools that you might be able to use to help manage anxiety, anticipate anxiety, and kind of get through kind of triggers that inevitably will come up during this season. So I'll give a little bit of introduction about her and then just jump right into it. So Mitzi VanCleve is the author of Strivings Within, the OCD Christian, Overcoming Doubt in the Storm of Anxiety. So in addition to being an OCD survivor, she is an educator, speaker, and advocate about OCD treatment. So separate from all of this is that she, if you see any posts from her, I don't know how she does it, but she is able to keep orchids alive and thriving and beautiful. It seems to be one of her hobbies, or definitely is one of her hobbies. And she is doing an amazing job at that. So I had a lot of fun chatting with her. She has such knowledge, such wisdom about OCD, about scrupulosity, and she's so generous with her time as well. So without further ado, here is my interview with Mitzi VanCleve. All right, thank you so much, Mitzi VanCleve, for joining us today for the Fearcast to talk about Christmas time, to talk about how to manage anxiety and obsessions and compulsions and just worries around Christmas for pretty much anybody, but also specifically those who are suffering from religious scrupulosity, the religious and faith-based and also morality-based subtype of obsessive compulsive disorder. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, I'm really happy to be able to do this. And I was afflicted quite a lot myself with that form of OCD, so I'm pretty familiar with what that's like to go through that, especially during the holiday and the Christmas seasons, where there's so much more of a focus on our faith at that time. My background is that I've had OCD probably most of my life, as far back as I can remember, but I didn't know I had OCD. And that made a huge difference in how it went in my life. And so, I mean, there were things in my childhood that, looking back, and I think this is true for a lot of people, you're like, oh, that was OCD. But I really didn't come to the knowledge of OCD until I was 50 years old, which is quite shocking, because back in my 20s, I went through really bad spells of harm OCD and various different kinds of OCD that were quite crippling, and panic disorder too, and not really knowing what it was, and just kind of fumbling through for a few years, becoming really debilitated at times. But it was OCD scrupulosity, or religious OCD, when I was 50 years old, that led me to the knowledge that I had OCD. And just knowing that you can go that long and not know you have OCD it really made me know that there was a lot of people just like me out there, which led me to write about my experience in a book. It's called Strivings Within the OCD Christian. It's available on Amazon, which also led me to start a blog and to start a support group on Facebook, and that's grown to like 2,000 members at this point, Christians who struggle with anxiety and OCD. So that's how it got all started for me. And I'm just happy to be here to share some of the ways I navigated that and still do today.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for all that, everything that you've written. I had first heard about you from clients I had, where I was working with them, and they said, "Gosh, I'm reading this woman, this Mitzi lady's blog about scrupulosity, and it's been really, really helpful." And I thought, I just got to go check this out. Then eventually got your book, and you've been doing a lot to try to just get information out there for people, and you're also right. The experience that you talked about of taking a really long time to get an appropriate diagnosis is unfortunately common, but luckily, just as things have been going on, more and more information is out there. More people are finding the right information that leads to the right diagnosis faster. So thank you so much for being a part of that process of getting the right and good information out there.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm delighted to be able to share. And so I guess we could kind of dive in with some of the things during the Christmas season that those of us who have had scrupulosity or right now are struggling with scrupulosity experience and how to kind of navigate our way through.
Yeah. So we put together a list of 5 things that can be really helpful to both keep in mind and also do to stay on the, I hesitate to say this, but here I go anyways, to stay on the right course, to be focused in keeping your head above water and not letting anxiety or obsessions overwhelm. But I'm wondering if you're comfortable, if you'd be able to share a little bit about some of the ways that you started to notice that scrupulosity was impacting your life and how it had manifested itself. Because I think it can show up differently for a lot of people, and for some people, and we've talked about this a number of times before on the Faith and Doubt series here, that sometimes within faith, having scrupulous behaviors or having scrupulous leanings can be accentuated, can be praised, can be encouraged. So it kind of a diagnosis seems to be missed in that process.
Yes. I think it can be missed because also when you go to a pastor or a trusted Christian friend and you begin to talk about what you're going through, it can really be perceived as maybe a spiritual problem that's correctable, through spiritual means. But for me, what happened with me was I was already kind of in a nosedive with other kinds of anxiety when scrupulosity hit. I was having an increase in my panic disorder. It was kind of coming back. I was having health obsessions. I know a lot of people with OCD go through that too. And so I recognized I was kind of spiraling at the time. But during that time, all it took was I was listening to a sermon on tape while doing dishes, trying to just distract myself from all the other stuff, the health obsessions and the panic disorder and all that I was going through. And the pastor that was speaking started talking about those kind of sermons, evidence for your faith being real, which are so triggering for a lot of people with scrupulosity. And he just made this one statement, about if you're still struggling with sin, to a pretty large degree, or it's like something you're dealing with all the time, you might want to take a second look and see if you're really, truly a Christian, a believer. And it was just like a gut punch. It was like that thought all these years, it was like, why? It just laid me so low. And it was like an instant panic attack when he said that. And of course, I started arguing back in my mind right away. Well, wait a second. all Christians struggle with sin. That's ridiculous. We don't become a Christian, come to know Christ, and then that's it. We never sin again, So I knew logically he wasn't right, but emotionally, my emotions were like, no, this is really important. This is something you really need to pay attention. And then it just, from there on out, it just took right off. And I mean, it ended up, I did everything. I had the intrusive thoughts that would come along with the blasphemous thoughts that would pop in just like out of nowhere. I started to have thoughts about, well, remember you used to read a lot of apologetics. You really loved apologetics. Probably the whole reason you did that was you never really were a believer anyway, which wasn't why I read them. But it was just a constant war, in my head. And I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat. I'm always affected like that with my anxiety. I struggle especially to eat. But while I was compulsively researching on the internet, doubting your faith, how can you be sure you're still saved? And I was pulling up all sorts of articles by pastors and ministers, but right in the middle of all that, something pops up that said, Religious OCD Scrupulosity. And I clicked on the link and it led me to a forum on OCD Scrupulosity, a Christian forum. And I just started reading the posts and it was like I was reading my own story. And from there, I did the right kind of research, was to find out what is this thing that I didn't know I had, all these years. And I learned a lot from there on out about how to manage it, ERP being the big thing, of course. But that's my little backstory of when it first reared its head in my life.
Right. Oh, man. I'm so appreciative that you found a good forum. And that, but what I say that because there can be a lot of unfortunate and unhelpful forums, even on Facebook. But but that's a separate conversation. But so you said something interesting there. You said once you found out about it and you started doing, quote, the right kind of research. What was it? What was that? What's the right kind of research, and how do you differentiate that between the, quote, wrong kind of research?
Good question. So we'll start with the wrong kind of research, which is what I was actually doing, which was really in response to the anxiety, to the obsession, to that intense need to solve it, to get that answer that would bring that final certainty and reassurance. And that's, of course, the trap of OCD, the cycle that just keeps it, front and center in your brain with the great big exclamation points, pay attention to this. So that was the wrong kind of research. The right kind of research was me saying to myself, I have to consider that this is really a disorder. And I have to look into, how do I treat this? How do I manage it? What can I do? And so that led me to websites like, I'm sure you've heard of Dr. Stephen Phillipson, his website on OCD and various other websites that, the International OCD Foundation website. And I began reading those materials and trying to stay, it was hard, trying to stay clinical about it in the treatment and, pursuing treatment. But that's not to say I got there just instantly. Right. I mean, obviously this went on for a while with me. Well, what if in my case it isn't OCD? That kind of stuff. And it's really me not believing. It's really me doubting. It's really me turning into an atheist, all that stuff.
Right. So often when I talk with scrupulous folks, there can be this thought of, and really entertaining that, or even saying, if I'm truly a Christian, truly a believer, it's a good thing for me to analyze this and to really get down to what can I do to eliminate sin in my life and to increase a connection with God.
Yes.
How do you combat that, or how have you? What do you do with that inclination, or how do you advise someone who has that inclination?
Well, I really think you have to look at what's driving the inclination. Mm-hmm. And if you are looking at an anxiety disorder, you have to think about whether it's the anxious, intense anxiety that's driving you to make sure you're doing the right thing, make sure your belief is real, or whether it's a genuine, legitimate, logical question. Because there's a difference. I mean, I read apologetics for years. I had questions. Mm-hmm. I had things I wondered about, but there was never a frantic sense of urgency that was just like the world's coming to an end feeling, mm-hmm. Which is what OCD feels like to me. It feels like if I don't solve this, the whole world is coming to an end. So it's very different. So I use that as, even today, as kind of a way to sort out my OCD concerns or questions or doubts over against something that's really valid. Something that's really valid, it isn't like that. I mean, there's a calmness. You might have somewhat of a concern, but it's a very measured calmness as you approach it. It's totally different. So I really use that as my gauge with my OCD.
Yeah. And I think that using the urgency and that have to feeling can be a great red flag to say, this is probably my OCD. This is probably my obsession. Not to say that it absolutely, it always is.
Right.
But this is a good way to round up, and this is a likely chance that this is my obsession, because historically speaking, that's the way it has shown up for me. Yes. And it sounds like that's the way it showed up for you. You got that gut punch, as you said, that feeling. You can probably say, all right, this is probably this. Because so much of the time, and I know we're going to talk shortly here on the importance of feeling within scrupulosity, and it can in a sense be a double-edged sword, but it's also like, it sounds like you are taking that sense of feeling but using that as a point in the right direction, and you're kind of separating from following through on that urgency.
I expect when I'm really having a big episode of OCD, where I'm kind of in a flare of it, I expect that it's always going to feel risky to treat it like it's OCD. And I've accepted that, mm-hmm. To go ahead and live with the uncertainty, like, well, there is this slight chance it might not be, but like you said, historically, if I go ahead and treat it like OCD, I find out, that is, in the long run, that's what it was. Retrospect is a great teacher. It really is. Because you sometimes look back and go, wow, really? Mm-hmm. When you're better, when you're doing better.
Right.
So,
I jokingly call this anxious drunk, in the sense that, if someone is drinking, they drink too much. Sometimes that happens. I don't want to alarm you, but sometimes that happens. When that happens, people aren't thinking very clearly. They respond to silly things. They do things that are out of the ordinary for what they would like to do. Then when we're in that state, we need to sober up, and we wait on making big decisions. We don't drive in the car. We don't buy things we ought not to. And then we wait for us to sober up. Once we do that, we look back and say, all right, maybe I was thinking incorrectly here, but man, now that I'm clear-headed, I can make a reasonable, rational choice. Anxious drunk is the same. When we're in the middle of it, there's that anxiety, and there's the thoughts, and I should do this, and I should do it right now. This will be the smart and wise choice for me to do. We're anxious drunk then. We need to anxious sober up, let that feeling come down, and then we can make a more rational choice afterwards.
It's utterly compelling, and that feeling. And I tell people that's why we do compulsions, because it's so compelling. It's compelling because when it's working right, that part of the brain that warns of real danger, real emergencies, we're supposed to have that fight or flight response. But in OCD, there's an inordinate amount of that just attaches itself to the theme or the obsession. It needs a target It's like, well, you got all this anxiety going on, and it just kind of like, oh, that'll do. I'll take that because that's important to you. So it is a very intense, compelling feeling. So you do have to let it come up, ride it out, let it come down. It's just it just takes a lot of practice to do that.
Yes, and again, practice, as they say, practice makes perfect. They'll all say practice makes better, right? We need to trust and try it out. But hearing you say it just now was the way you said I think you said something about the obsessions or the anxiety is compelling.
Yes,
I think this is a point that a lot of people don't understand. A lot of people who are, out of the club here, family members, friends who don't know what's going on, pastors who don't know what's going on. That feeling is very convincing. I maintain, had it not been for the feeling, you wouldn't do anything about it. There wouldn't be OCD. Everything we're doing is about that feeling, and this is where I would say. So, I guess tell me a little bit more about maybe, or if you have either some examples or could share a little bit about how that feeling impacted you in the throes of things, and then I want to talk a little bit about your thoughts and feelings about Christmas, just to lighten things up briefly. But tell me a little bit about that feeling, about how it's so compelling.
Well, I would say that the feeling, the anxiety that attaches itself to the thoughts, like, I know that I can give an example, I guess. I think I told you about how the thought came into my mind in the throes of this, that I had been very heavily interested in apologetic work. So I've read everything C.S. Lewis has ever written, probably, and, Francis Schaeffer and all the great apologists. And the thought came into my mind during all of this, because this is the way intrusive thoughts are, and that maybe you did that because you never really were a believer. Now, that thought happened, I understand now, just through the association, because my feeling was I might not be really a Christian from that initial statement.
Right.
So everything associated with someone who might not be a Christian, the intrusive thoughts came. So when that thought came, the anxiety with that was just so crippling and so compelling that it just felt like I had to find a way to prove that I really, really, truly, truly believed. And when you're getting into those words, like, how do I know that I really believe? Well, it seems like with this anxiety that I don't. Does that mean that I'm heading towards atheism? Is that where I'm going to end up? And what that caused me to do was to fight mentally in my head all the time about all the things I'd learned in apologetics, why I believed it, how long I'd been a believer, how long I'd been living for the Lord, all the evidences all through my life. I would go through all of that. I would talk to my husband about it, and just try to get some feeling of reassurance, some proof, some evidence that would just lay it all to rest. But the more I did that, I was giving weight and credence to the idea, the whole obsessional theme, because the more you pay attention to it, the more your brain says it is urgent, it is important. And so it just became this unending cycle where if I could fall asleep at night, when I woke up in the morning, my eyes would pop open and it'd be like, oh, that's right. Here we go, and so I could go around the house like a robot, but in my head, I was just very busy all the time. I guess I'm what they call the Puro type. There was some avoidance too that was going on there also with, it was hard to read the Bible because stuff would pop out and seem to accuse or go to church. They were all believers, obviously. And I, by the way, look at how they acted, and here I'm sitting here just terrified, they seem so confident and so full of joy, full of the joy of the Lord, and my husband might as well have been wearing a halo at that time in comparison to how I saw myself. So it's very compelling.
Yeah.
And logic just doesn't seem to help. I mean, it's like, and I believe that's because it is that compelling anxiety response that other people who don't have OCD don't experience, with the odd or weird intrusive thought that pops in their head, because everybody gets weird thoughts from time to time, and they're just like, I don't believe that. Right. Dismiss it,
Right. Yeah. And that idea of do I believe or don't I? There's that all or nothing, but also like there's that slim sliver of 100%. That's believe all the things. But if I'm 99% in, that's in disbelief section.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, 99% is still passing on pretty much any test, except for OCD's test. Yeah. So we have to just be that little bit. And also there's that promise of apologetics, right? Yeah. The promise of this is how I can know, this is how I can prove through logic and reason this thing that is outside of logic and reason, that fits in within the supernatural realm.
It's interesting because when I studied apologetics, my whole reason for that was just to be able to share my faith more effectively.
Sure. With
people who had real skepticism, real questions, not OCD-driven questions, but to just kind of be better equipped, And so that wasn't my motive, but of course OCD twisted that around, into it being the motive. So, but yeah, feelings, that's a huge thing. It was with me, and it was with, and it is with people that I talk to who are struggling with this. And so, going into the Christmas season, I think it can be particularly difficult for someone in the throes of OCD, this type of OCD, to be around people who, in situations where Christ's birth is being celebrated, and everyone is just so seemingly full of joy and just their faith. They just seem to be glowing in comparison. And that's the problem. It's we get into this, what I call emotional checking with scrupulosity. I should or ought to have this feeling when I'm thinking about Christ's birth and incarnation. Instead, I either feel terrified that I don't believe, or I'm completely numb. I don't feel any joy.
Right.
Or I'm upset and angry because I can't. And does that mean I'm mad at God? Just all sorts of stuff. But this emotional checking, people are always checking, and I did it, for the right emotions when they're in this situation, what they think they should be feeling. And that is just a hole you don't want to go down. You have, when you're struggling with scrupulosity, you should not compare the way you're feeling when you're in the throes of that to other people, because it's just futile. The more you try to muster that feeling up, the less it's ever going to appear, because all your intense scrutinizing of your feelings, why don't I feel this, or why don't I feel that? It just blocks the natural flow of emotion, where the only feeling you really feel is anxiety. That's front and center. That's what you're feeling, and that's an emotion. But it's an emotion that you have to learn to accept as part of the process when you're going through this form of OCD. So, I mean, I was jealous of people during this time. I really was, And
what's interesting is that what's frustrating, perhaps, is this that assumption you mentioned that everyone else seemed to be so happy and joyous and full of life in comparison to me. And there was almost this assumption that, everyone else probably saw you as being, just distant and cold and outside the camp, in a sense.
Right. Definitely, it's how I worried. That's how God saw me.
And the reality
is outside the fold. That sheep bleeding to get in.
Mm-hmm.
But well, I'm sorry, but you don't really have enough faith. That feeling.
Right. And the irony is that, likely speaking, people did in fact look at you and said, "Gosh, look at Mitzi. She seems to be so on fire, so close. She must be enjoying this so much." And it's because internally, that's where, as you said, you said you're experiencing a lot of pure O stuff, and it's because that's where the compulsions are are living, just between your ears.
Yes, and that is true. I think that a lot of people going through this kind of OCD, it's a hidden, isolating thing because it's going on internally, and you're just on the outside. You look normal, you seem normal, you might be able to go and sit in a church service, but I remember that just being a really difficult thing to get through for me. I did it because I wanted, and that's another aspect of whatever your feelings are, you can still follow through with what a Christian or a person who wants to celebrate Christmas would do, and being with your family and going with your family. But you're right. I don't think anybody picked up on it other than the fact that I was getting thinner, not eating well, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And we've been kind of touching on our first point here, which is to discount the importance of the feeling for the season. So, and I think we've talked about this, where it's, there can be a strong desire for people to want that we're supposed to feel something around this time of year. Not just in general, we're supposed to feel connected with God, or feel faithful, or to feel generous, or whatever the case may be, but specifically around certainly Christmas, and I think we talked about this before. This conversation could equally apply to Easter, whereas during Easter we're supposed to feel all these things and feel all these things, for lack of a better term. But how do you help someone to, or how would you guide someone to helping to kind of resist the efforts to force that good feeling, and to resist the urge to compare yourself to the responses or the perceived responses of others? Well,
I focus on actions a lot, and I was going to talk about this later, but I can mention it again. Okay. The act as if are three little words that help me a lot. That feelings aren't as important as what we're actually doing, and so OCD wants to pick something like that, like your emotions and your feelings and how you should feel, and it wants to blow it up into a big, hairy deal. And you can just say, you know what? That doesn't even matter. I'm still going to, spend time with my family at Christmas. I'm going to do the things I want to do. I'm going to go to church. I'm going to, not out of obligation, but just because that's what I want to do. That's what I choose to do. So there's choice in this. And I feel that our feelings catch up to our behavior. So act as if has helped me. But another example I give, because for a lot of people with OCD, we have more than one kind that we've been through. And one kind that's very similar to this, when we're talking about this relational feeling or emotional feeling we should have toward God and toward the Christmas holiday, because we're celebrating Him, because this is a relational type thing that we have in our faith with God, is to compare it to relationship OCD, where there's a couple and, she might have relationship OCD about her husband, and she might have the same problem. Well, wait, do I really love him? I don't know if I feel like I love him, and start to examine the emotions as evidence. And so a therapist isn't going to say, you should try to muster that up. He's going to say, act as if. You keep on behaving as if you love him. And you just got to put those anxiety feelings over to the side and choose what you want to do. So that's kind of one way with the emotional thing. And I also say that as far as pleasing God, which is more pleasing to God, when you're just naturally full of those joyful emotions where you feel at peace about your relationship and your faith with him. And so you're doing all those things while you're feeling that, or which is more pleasing to him when you're doing those things even when you're not feeling that connection or the emotions that you think you should have, and yet you're still willing to stay in that relationship with God. You're still willing to practice your faith, and so you just have to do that with OCD. I think it's brought into a lot of different types of OCD, but the closest one I can compare it to, I think, is relationship OCD when it comes to the right emotional feeling that we think we should have. And maybe you can add a little bit to that, because I don't know if I covered it, all the different ways you can get past that, but that's the way that helps me.
And I think that's a great way to view it. And I gave up many years ago in doing this podcast. I gave up on trying to hit all the points.
Yeah.
Inevitably, there will be someone listening to this who will say, what do they know? They missed the way that I experience it. And to that person, we're going to miss something. But I digress. Yeah. So to that point about forcing that feeling, I love the comparison to relationship OCD, because yes, it is a relationship, and I've also likened it to an elaborate harm OCD, where we're kind of worried that we are somehow damaging the relationship that we have with God, or damaging God in general, or myself within the context of the relationship with God. But when we think about that the assumptions that we have about what other people are feeling. Actually, even before I say that, your illustration of saying, what is more pleasing to God, that we just wait till we have those positive feelings, or do we do the things even though we sometimes don't have those positive feelings? I think we'll add this point a little bit later too, but I'll say it here too, is that we're dynamic people.
Yeah. Some days
we're into things, and some days we're not into the same things. And I gave this example. Some days, my wife is completely annoyed by me for good reason. And some days she loves me. Loves meaning has that warm lovey-dovey feeling, right? And vice versa. It's because we have good days and bad days, and on days and off days, and to say that we're only supposed to have on days all the time denies our humanity.
Exactly.
And back to that all or nothing. If I only have, if it's only I'm on or I'm off, then it's 100% I'm on. And then if I'm 99% on and just I'm distracted or tired or whatever, then I'm off. Then we're signing ourselves up for a life of failure. And within that relationship, perhaps, even with my wife, if either I have the lovey-dovey wonderful feelings that I had, the tippity top of how I felt when we first started dating versus, any other time where things fluctuate, I'm automatically in failure town.
Oh yeah, I think that's a really good comparison. And I think with OCD, with the religious OCD, it's just one of those things that the disorder will latch onto. It's like a phase, because it seems to kind of like go to different tracks, religious OCD. But I know that the right emotions we think we should have toward God is a huge one, and the harder we try to muster them up, the worse that gets, because just all that effort is validating that it really matters, that we're not feeling like we think we should feel, because that isn't what it's about, but the OCD will say that's important. Then it'll shift to something else, you get past that and it'll just shift to something else.
Right.
That's the way it does.
Right. So, I mean, in the sake of time, since I know we've spent a lot of time on this, jump down just briefly to number 2. So these are kind of 5 different things that we can keep in mind or think about or do in the holiday season. And number 2 that I've written down here is kind of write a letter to your future anxious self. Now, this can certainly be a reassurance step, but it's also a step that can help us ground ourselves in what we truly know about ourselves. And this gets back to my previous point about kind of being anxious drunk, is that when we're in the middle of our anxiety, we're not thinking clearly. We think that this is reasonable, that I ought to do this. But when we're in our clear state of mind, it can be helpful to write a letter to ourselves. If we know that we're going to get freaked out by something, all right, I'm just going to write a little letter to myself saying, all right, self, these are going to be the things that are probably going to freak you out. These are some truths that you can know about yourself, about the holiday, about people, about your relationship with God, about God in general, to help ground ourselves. It's not to say in this letter, everything's fine, you're saved, nothing wrong is ever going to happen in your life. Because that's ultimately going to be unhelpful too. But we can put down some of these truths. I'm wondering if there are some things that perhaps you would have written down for yourself, or you could encourage someone to write down that grounds them in some basic truths about themselves that fight against anxiety.
Yeah, I think that it's just, with me, in the case of scrupulosity, it would just be that I know that I desired Christ. Because if I didn't desire to have that relationship, this OCD wouldn't even have latched onto it. So it's kind of like, and I've told people this, it's almost like your faith is really so strong that this is the most important thing, in your existence, your relationship to God and where you stand with Him. It's so strong, and your belief is so strong that that's why OCD latches onto it. You couldn't even, if it was just kind of an unimportant thing to you, that wouldn't happen. So I would just stress, probably historically, I would go back to what my walk with Christ has been all along, and just the ways that He's blessed me in my life, the way that relationship has been so enriching. And that one thing I've always said, because I could go back and see periods of my life where I had different anxious themes, now that I knew it was OCD, and you know what? I got better. This too shall pass. And it's just that putting one foot in front of the other and persevering through it, that I would come out the other side. And so it would be along those lines of just encouraging that right now it feels really rough, but you've felt really rough before. You've been in some really bad places before. And just in this persevering of staying the course, so to speak. It would be a staying the course letter, I think, to encourage me.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's including elements in that. So I spoke a while ago to Ted Witzik, and he calls this a forward-moving faith. That's not to get stuck in analysis before we take that step forward. It's we keep moving forward in whatever it is that you're going to do. And there's a lot of behavior. Forward moving faith does not imply the feeling. So it's that encouragement of how do you to continue to move forward with whatever those rituals or routine, the appropriate religious rituals, right? The ritual of going to church, or of whatever your particular faith tradition has as the holiday tradition.
Yes,
perhaps everyone knew what I meant, but I'm all of a sudden going to switch things up and advocate for compulsions. That sounds like something I'm going to do.
Yeah, let's do rituals.
Yeah, all right.
I knew what you were driving at. Just the traditional, the things you have chosen to do as a follower of God or of Christ around your faith, that you can, OCD doesn't have the power to stop that. I'll hear people say sometimes, well, I can't do this or I can't do that. And I'll be like, why?
Yeah.
Because it'll make me feel anxious. Yeah.
It will.
And then you just do it.
Right. And conversely, they'll say, I can't do this.
Right.
I can't go to church. I can't listen to the sermon.
Right.
Yes, you can. It'll be hard, though. It'll be uncomfortable, but we do a lot of uncomfortable things in life.
No.
You said you live in the Midwest. It's cold.
Yes.
That's uncomfortable.
It is. It is.
And yet there you are amongst yeah, go ahead.
We do winter every year. I don't look forward to it, but somehow I get through it.
Somehow.
I just go out there and plod through the snow and put my coat on, and then I say, and spring will come again.
And this too shall pass. And yes. So it's something that we were kind of getting to, and I think this ultimately just gets to our third point, which is identify your typical compulsions and work to create boundaries around them.
Yes, I think one of the big problems with this kind of OCD, or any kind of OCD that's sort of a Puro type OCD, is it's a little bit harder for people to even know that they're engaging in compulsions. Right. So it's really important to know what those are, so you can put on the brakes when you're headed down that path. Or you can say, you know what, I'm going to think about that later. So identifying, because a lot of times people don't even know, that I had this thought, and it was so upsetting, and I didn't want that thought. That's the last thing I wanted to think. So I prayed and confessed to God and told him I was sorry that I had that thought. But then I had it again. So I prayed, so it's just, you just stop that. The praying, the confessing, the attending. To me, it's just attending. It's even this mental pushing back, arguing in your head about when the thoughts come that you might not be a true believer, and you're sitting there firing back at it, yes, I am, because this, and then something comes back at you, but what about this?
What about that?
What about that? And then you're fighting with that. So it's this mental rumination and arguing. It's people do undoing statements.
Yeah.
So if they have like a blasphemous thought, they'll try to undo it with a certain kind of positive thought about God. It's all sorts of things. And reassurance seeking, I think, is one of the hardest for people with this to stop. It is, particularly in the forums,
yeah.
People come in, I had this thought, I had that thought, and now I'm really worried that this means maybe I'm not really a Christian, because why would a Christian think something like that? Mm-hmm. And then people come back with all these reassuring verses, and God will never leave you or forsake you. It seems really good that they're doing that, but that just feeds the disorder, because again, it validates the whole idea that the questions and the doubts and the thoughts are worth your time and attention. Right. And the more you're giving them time and attention, the more that OCD machine it revs up. One way I handled it with these different compulsions, or the urge to engage in them, was I kind of did I remember back in the day, I pictured it like a waiting room. I had these appointments with all these thoughts and questions and doubts that were pressing in and wanted to engage with me.
Yeah.
And I would be like, you know what? I can hear you. I know you're there. But putting you over there in the waiting room, because I've got other things to do. And maybe I'll think about you later, and maybe I won't. But for now, you sit over there. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't hear it or that you're not aware of it, but you're just kind of mentally saying, you're not really that important. So you just sit over there, and that helped me with my boundary. I had to have kind of a visual thing in my mind of like, almost like they were little people, that I don't have time for you. And so that helped me.
Right. Yeah, I love that image, because there's a decision to be made there. You're not letting that urgency convince you that all of a sudden this thought needs to jump the line and, come out of the waiting room. we decide I'm gonna choose to put this one to the side just for now. It doesn't mean forever. It doesn't mean whatever it is. It's just I don't need to do this right now. I can do almost anything else. That can be counterintuitive, or that can sound crazy to someone who's just in the throes of it, where they feel that one, the emotional component compels them this is important, and two, convinces them that this thought or the action of evaluation or ruminating about it is a spiritually appropriate and reasonable behavior.
Right.
That as a Christian, this is something I ought to do. This is good for me to do.
And that can be reinforced by unwitting people who unwittingly, are trying to help you, but they're just clueless. And so I tell people, once you understand you have OCD, you can't just go to anybody and start asking these questions or asking what you should do about it, because to them, if they're another Christian, this might seem like, well, they can fix that for you.
Right.
They'll open up their Bible and they'll say,
here's this verse
and that right
verse.
Here
Yeah.
answers that. And then they close their Bible like, okay,
nailed
we're done.
it, fixed it.
But they have no clue about how OCD operates and why you're struggling. And so they end up feeding it, and they also can end up very frustrated with you because you're just going to come back.
Right.
With more.
And to that point about forums, it feels so heartless. It's unhelpful to get that reassurance from other people. But if someone goes on there and says, gosh, I'm having this, the classic one, I'm having the worry that maybe I blaspheme the Holy Spirit. It's heartless for someone to go up there and just go, maybe.
Yeah.
But ultimately that is the position that we ultimately need to take with this. Yes. Maybe. And what else are we going to do today?
Yeah.
As we move on.
Yeah, that's what I would say. Well, right now I've got a lot of, things to take care of. I need to clean the house, I need to do the dishes, I got this meal sitting on, so I really don't have time for this. And when I was younger, the kids, I needed to take care of the kids or whatever.
Yeah.
And I don't really have time for you right now. And it helps, that putting off, because what you're doing is you're just showing your brain and your anxiety center that it's okay. You can just let that be. And you're retraining, habituating your brain to see it and perceive it differently. And as long as we continue to treat it like it's a valid emergency, it's going to continue to feel that. We're unwittingly feeding it, by all of that reassurance seeking and all of that attending that we're doing. And so it's really important for people with OCD to understand how OCD operates and what's going on, because it helps them to know, oh, wait, this is what I'm doing, and this is what I need to stop doing.
Right. And to that point, to continue on with this, with the, identifying your typical compulsions, working on resisting reading the Bible, praying, reading other books that can, in a compulsive manner that's motivated by the anxious feeling, in order to gain that reassurance, or to at least kind of get rid of that guilty feeling. Right.
Which is always temporary. I mean, you do those things and you be like, okay, and that lasts 20 minutes, I don't know. I mean, when you're really bad, it doesn't last long at all. But yeah, you have to stop that kind of researching as driven by the anxiety.
Right.
As driven by, I need that compelling need to, it's wanting to feel safe, so that I'll feel safe. And so identifying that's what's motivating you to read your Bible. So when you're going through this, you don't want to just say, well, I can never read my Bible again.
Right.
That's not the way we approach it. You have to have a way to read your Bible that's different than being compelled by the disorder. So I recommend to people that, if you want to keep learning and growing in your faith by studying your Bible, then get a study guide on a topic, and follow the study guide, just, a short bit a day, instead of like researching because of what the OCD is telling you need to figure out. You do that differently. That's a whole different experience than just frantically flipping through your Bible or books to find that one answer that's going to lay out all the rest. It's a whole different. So you got to really look at the motivation, for resisting, reading the Bible for the wrong reason, to feed the OCD,
right,
or books, or, pastors, or, pastors' lectures, or whatever.
Right. I love that you added to this point. You said, conversely, if reading the Bible causes triggers,
Yes.
then work towards gradually reading it, gradual exposure to that.
Yeah. And I had to do that. I mean, it's funny now when I see the different ways the OCD twisted scripture that I'd always known to mean something that I knew it didn't mean. Mm-hmm. But I would just be reading and stuff would just kind of almost jump off the page.
Right.
Aha! And, I remember this one time it was and unless you have the faith of a little child, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven. And I was just oh my goodness, I don't think I have that kind of faith, because that's just that kind of faith that just believes like kids believe in Santa Claus. I mean, and I just don't, and I just freaking out. Whereas really what that means is just grace. It's, in other words, it's the idea that when children are utterly dependent on their parents for everything, not because they're such wonderful little children that they do all these things that it just makes us really want to take care of them and feed them and clothe them and house them. We do that because there are babies, there are children. We love them, right. And they just accept and receive that. They just, because they know they can't. It's that poor in spirit. Yes. That's what that verse means. It's that. Yeah, you basically can't bring anything to the table, so you have to trust God. Right. He's got this. But my OCD just grabbed that and went the exact wrong way with it, and so that's how triggers can happen. Right. And so you have to just and I think we've talked about this before. You have to expect when you're doing this kind of exposure, if you're triggered by the Bible, that you're going to be triggered. Right. Recognize it, and then just accept it and write it out. Later on, you'll be able to come back and go, oh, wait a second. Write out the anxiety. That isn't what that meant, But during the time, you can't just say, well, that's it. I'll never read the Bible again because I'm triggered. Because again, avoidance, whatever we run from, whatever we avoid, it just reinforces that is something that to be feared.
Exactly. Right. Gosh, to the point about having what I call the underminer, or having the complete opposite thought pop in. When that verse popped out to you, they said you have to have faith as a child. And you're like, oh, okay, well, I have to have this. Okay, how do I have the faith of a child? Conversely, later on, the Bible talks about growing in and developing a mature faith. Right, and putting away childish things. Right, moving on to moving on past the milk onto the meat, or something to that effect. Right. Well, which one is it? Bible. Yeah, and it can feel very confusing. But I love what you had also done. You kind of said, well, here's probably what this means, or you looked this up, and you not looked this up, but you went, here's probably what it meant, and I'm going to go with it. Yeah. But it's just amazing how it'll just, I say what OCD likes to do is pull verses out of context and twist them around to mean something they don't mean. So that's why because your mind and your brain is kind of on that topic. You might not be a believer. You might not really have the faith that you need to be safe, to go to heaven someday. So it's just kind of easy. It makes those easy jumps and associations, and it does tend to see things out of context. Right. And so to move on, our next point was to anticipate the anxiety. Yes. And you added here to hold two things in mind. Tell me about expect and accept.
Well, I think particularly for the Christmas season, because there's so much more of a focus on, we talked about just even the miraculous incarnation, the aspect of, the Virgin giving birth and just all the things, the mystery, that's there. With OCD, scrupulosity, it's like,
proof.
That's gonna flare up those doubts. Like, do I believe that? Just because the brain just does that, it makes these creative associations. Well, what would a person who's a non-believer think at this moment? So when you're dealing with this, you have to really expect in certain situations, like reading the Bible or listening to a sermon, going to a Christmas concert, you have to expect that because you're in the throes of this, you're probably going to be triggered. And when you're anticipating that that's probably going to happen, instead of just like, oh, I hope that doesn't happen, or I don't want that to happen, it changes the dynamics. It's like, oh yeah, I knew this was going to happen.
Right.
Nice try, OCD. And I'm just going to sit. Yeah, my anxiety just went up, and it's like, I knew that was going to happen too.
Right.
And you can just ride it out. So there's a expecting, but there's also an accepting of it. That it's how we say this, it's abnormally normal with OCD for that to happen.
Yes.
So it's like, it just helps, instead of just thinking you won't be or you don't want to be, it helps to just kind of be ahead of the OCD, to get ahead of it in that way. And that's why I like those two words. And that's how I use them whenever I'm dealing with something where I'm struggling with an obsessional theme and I'm going to do something. I'm just like, yeah, that's going to trigger me. Oh, well.
Yeah. And oh, well, here we go.
Yeah.
I'm going to feel anxiety, but also with that, expecting that anxiety, knowing that it's going to be there, and then giving ourselves that permission to ride that through, going like, this is going to suck, and it's going to feel uncomfortable, and I'm not going to like it. And in no way does accept mean you have to like it, or that you have to be okay with it, or square it somehow. It can be left as, this is unfortunate, and this is not the way that it was designed, or I quote, should be feeling. But guess what? It's the way that I am feeling. Yeah. So I know it's going to happen. Buckle up. Here we go. I was telling you earlier that at the end of every podcast, my brain says, this is going to be the last podcast I ever do, because this is, it's going to be the worst one, and it's going to be terrible, and everyone's going to, the whole OCD community is going to think that I'm a blah, 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 and all this stuff. And I expect that thought now, and it has yet to happen. Right. But maybe it's this one that does it.
Exactly. It probably is because I'm on. See, that's what my OCD says.
Right. And yes. And the flip side is, I'm like, it has nothing to do with you. This is my. But here we go. We're doing the same thing, right? Yeah. Buckle up. We knew this was going to happen. We knew this thought was going to be there, and yet here we are. So, anticipate your anxiety. If you're going to go in and if you're going to hear the story about the virgin birth, and your brain goes, do I really believe that? Right. Of course you're going to have that thought, especially if that's the thought that you have had for years, or it is latching onto this one central component to the Christmas story. What are the other things for you, listener, that are sticking points? Anticipate those. Write those things down. I call this anxiety bingo. We write down all the things that are going to bug us or going to freak us out, or we know where we're going to have these thoughts, feelings, images, sensations, and urges. We're going to write all those down, and then when they happen, we just check them off the list. Of course, it was there.
It's I used to do, this was just something I sort of did on my own, because humor and music are kind of like the opposite of what you might feel with anxiety. So I used to, it sounds weird, but with some of my obsessional themes that I knew was going to come in my head, thoughts, intrusive thoughts, doubts, things that I didn't want to think, and the worst case scenario stuff, I used to write it down in a way that was almost like rhyming. And then I would, in my mind, or when I was alone, sing it to the tune of the Teddy Bear's Picnic. So it was changing a perception with my brain by doing that. Kind of like, why is she singing a funny song about something so serious, but it helped me to kind of like, yep, and then this is going to happen, and then this will happen. And, I suppose with Christmas, you could do that with Jingle Bells or something.
Absolutely.
With all your different, intrusive thoughts, and just the horror of it set to the tune of Jingle Bells. It's a funny kind of exposure exercise, but I think it just kind of like shows the brain that you're willing to go there and even mock it a little bit. It's like, wait, bullies really hate to be mocked. And we always think of OCD as a bully. So that's kind of like, well, I guess I'm not winning today, the OCD. So that was that just popped in my head that I used to do that, with some of my screw thoughts and doubts.
Right. And I love that exercise or exercises like that, because you are poking fun at this and you're leaning into those feared thoughts. And for some, it can feel like it's a bridge too far, or it can feel excessively blasphemous. And there's a range on what people can do. What you're talking about there is an active exposure for someone to do, and they are incredibly helpful. But for someone who's not quite there yet, they don't have to actively bring that up. All they have to do is accept the expect and accept just the stuff that is there. And both of these approaches are completely valid and completely helpful. And it's just, maybe it's different ways. I call it different ways to get in shape, right? Yes. You can go to the gym, or you can get a job at a moving company. Both are going to get in shape. You're just going to get in shape in different ways, right? Well,
and there's a progression where when you go through the expect and accept, and you get braver with exposures as you go along. You might not be ready at that point, but when you've won a few, what I mean is when you've seen, the anxiety went up, it came down, I didn't engage in the compulsions, and you've been doing that for a while,
and
then you're like,
still here.
Let's ramp it up a little bit here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's it. And for those who are out there just listening to this, who are new at this process, this is a good process to start with. Expect and accept. Starting to take that approach, and when you start to see, I can do this, I can have this thought, I don't have to do the compulsion, I ride that out, and nothing happens. Right. It's not the end of the world. Use that as motivation to take that next step, and whatever that next step is, and keep chasing the bully around the yard at that point. So to our last point, and I have no idea how long this episode is going to end up being, but here we go. It's our last point was, let yourself have the anxiety. And we've been kind of making this point, write it out. And I jokingly to myself, when I was writing this, I got the image of making room at the inn for anxiety in the Christmas spirit. That we, don't guilt ourselves for the fact that we're feeling this feeling of, maybe we are going to feel joy and peace and love and kindness, but maybe we're going to feel emptiness, tired and annoyed, anxious and frustrated. And there's room, we can have room in our life for all of them, because again, we're dynamic people. All of them are completely acceptable feelings. So we shouldn't let our anxiety dictate what is acceptable and not acceptable. We decide that.
Yeah, choice is huge in dealing with OCD. And I think in the realm of OCD scrupulosity, choice has been one of the biggest things that has helped me along. And that's just the act as if, people will say, I want to be a Christian. I want to be a follower of Christ. I want to do this. I want to do that. And I say, do it then. And they look sort of confused about that. But I'm like, well, are you saying you want to feel it or you want to do it? Because really, there's more to be gained in your faith walk of doing the things that you value, that you've decided in your life are important to you as a Christian, even when doing some of that stuff triggers you. And it's hard to do, but you just choose to do it anyway. To me, that's just more of you're putting feet to your faith. I think it takes greater faith. I mean, Christ himself, the Bible tells us, we have examples of his anxiety that he experienced about a very real world situation for him. When he was going to Jerusalem and he knew what lay ahead, the Bible says he had to set his face like a flint. In other words, like that determined, persevering, one foot in front of the other. And then we see him in Gethsemane. There's a lot of anxiety there. I mean, a lot of anxiety, a lot of trepidation, and yet he had chose, this is what I'm going to do. And with our walk, the walk is what matters. And so with OCD, act as if is important to me, in this. It's like, yes, I'm feeling this, but I still have a choice. I can still walk in faithfulness to Christ, even when my feelings aren't lining up with that. And when you think about it, I think it would mean more to walk in faithfulness and doing what you have always traditionally done, what has always been important to you in your walk with the Lord, to continue doing that, rather than if you just had always felt happy and always had feelings of peace and joy and ease and then walking. I mean, which is a greater test of faith? So in a way, we're growing and stretching our legs of faith in the process. It's not pleasant, but we get to choose. And so that has helped me a lot, the act as if aspect of managing this form of OCD. It's no different than, like you were saying about harm OCD or relationship OCD. You're not going to be told by your therapist when you're struggling with a relationship OCD with a spouse or a girlfriend, we'll break up with them. Right. They're not going to tell you that. They're going to say, stay the course, and act as if. You don't have to have the right feelings to follow Christ or to love your spouse, to have the relationship. You choose it. You do it. And feelings catch up, to our behavior. Our behavior comes first. So that's helped me a lot. I mean, it doesn't make OCD go away. You still got to do the work, of learning about exposure and changing certain things in your lifestyle. You got to do that work, but while you're going through that, you still get to choose.
Right.
I hope that makes some sense.
I think it does. Before I think so. We've gotten through all of our points. I'm curious
Right.
though. What are your favorite? What are you looking forward to most about Christmas, or what do you like about the holiday?
Oh, definitely. To me, sharing Christmas with our family, our extended family, our grandkids, because we have 7 grandkids, and really getting to share not just the love in the family, but the love that's there because of our relationship to Christ and all that it means to us as Christians, and getting to share that with the grandkids and, really hear them say what it means to them, and in just showing Christ's love to them, our extended family. It's just been, it's like I'm old and I'm a grandma, but my job's not done yet. And so right now, Christmas that's really exciting for us is just definitely the extended family that God has given us, and getting to grow in our faith through sharing Christ with them.
That's fantastic.
So that's the good part.
And what's your favorite Christmas movie?
Oh my goodness!
If you have one,
this isn't going to be good. But I'm just trying to think. Well, first of all, I do love Dickens' A Christmas Carol. I like the musical versions of that.
Okay.
Probably are my favorite. I think the one Albert Finney did was really good, which is really old. And then I like humorous Christmas movies, like Elf. Is that what it's called?
Elf,
I can't remember.
The Will Ferrell one,
yeah. Yep. I like silly stuff. And Chevy Chase's, we watched that with the kids, his Christmas Vacation, so I do like, I like stuff like that too. Christians are allowed to laugh and enjoy humor. OCD will tell you they aren't. but they are.
I was going to say, I appreciate that you mentioned Elf, and particularly you mentioned Christmas Vacation, because there are a lot of questionable bits in the Christmas Vacation, but you know what?
Yep.
It's pretty stinking funny.
It is. And
you're hard pressed to send you can be a Christian and like those things too. So, to all of you who are listening who are concerned about that stuff, but anyhow, so I don't want to take up all of your evening, but is there anything else that you'd want to add or tag at the end of this? Maybe if there was one takeaway for a listener who has religious scrup and is struggling in this time, what's one thing that you would tell them?
So, two of the most meaningful quotes that helped me, really, really motivated me and really encouraged me when I was going through this was one thing that I read from C.S. Lewis. Was, and this is a major paraphrase because I have to say it in this way, but the gist of it is there. He said, our allegiance and our faith to Christ is never more powerful or meaningful than when we look around upon a universe where every trace of God seems to have disappeared, and yet we still choose to follow him and obey him. That was just that's where the act as if thing came for me. That was just so powerful, encouraging me that, yeah, I can still, follow and exercise my faith, even while I'm feeling, I can't even feel God in my life right now. That was powerful. And then I don't know if you've ever read John Bunyan's Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners, but it's basically a very long biographical story of how OCD impacted him. Not that he knew that he had OCD, but people have, that's what it was. And if you read it as a person with script, you'll find it out. And I liked what he said because it's along the same thing. So he was having his mental war of, do I believe? Do I really believe? And it was just causing him so much pain and so much agony. And he was having everything that I experienced. It was like reading my own story. So at the end of all this, he's just like, he kind of throws in the towel. And he says, you know what? I am for going on and venturing my eternal state with Christ. Whether I have comfort here or not, if God does not come in, thought I will leap off the ladder, even blindfolded into eternity. Sink or swim, come heaven, come hell. Lord Jesus, catch me if you will. But if not, I'm still going to venture all for your name. And I just loved how he allowed for the uncertainty. And he was like, you know what? I can't keep doing this. I'm just going to move forward. And I think that was the beginning of his release from that long, long struggle of just that kind of like, I can't keep doing this. And those quotes were really, I wouldn't say right off the bat, but as I learned more and more and more about OCD, they became really meaningful to me in that process. And especially in retrospect, I could see exactly what they were talking about and how the legs of my faith were stretched through this experience. And it ended up, I would say, stronger and more meaningful. I learned how to persevere. I learned about patience. I learned about empathy and compassion. I learned that you don't always know what people are going through when you think you know what people are going through. So there's also great lessons in the process. I know that nobody wants to believe that when you're in the middle of it, but there really are great lessons in affliction and suffering. And always remember, this too shall pass. That's the other thing I think that helps us to persevere. So that's about it.
That's about it. Well, I love all of that. Thank you so much for spending this time and sharing some of your insights and wisdom into how folks can handle just Christmas and also just handle religious scrupulosity, specifically from a Christian perspective. I'll put a link up to your book and your blog. But if people are wanting to learn a little bit more, where can they find you?
Well, they can find my blog. It's a WordPress blog just by researching my name and anxiety disorders or scrupulosity. And even on Amazon, you just have to put my name in and scrupulosity. But I'm on Facebook. We have a group for Christians, and it was supposed to be just about like all kinds of anxiety because we tend to have overlap. People with anxiety disorders tend to have like generalized anxiety, social anxiety, OCD. We kind of have this overlap. Yeah. But there's a huge number of people in there with OCD scrupulosity, and it's Christians with anxiety disorders. I'm trying to remember. Let's talk. And so I can send you that link later. But we get new people come in. We have a great group of moderators who really understand the disorder, which is helpful. So what that does is it just kind of lets you know you're not alone in your experience, but it also kind of encourages you to seek the right kind of help, not to go it alone, to really see it as a real disorder for which there's lots of help and that you can learn to manage it. And that's what we encourage people, because for Christians, all too often it's seen as a spiritual issue. And our goal is to get people the help they need so they can start to learn to manage it and live with it and have a good quality of life.
That's fantastic. So, yeah. Well, again, thank you so much. And
thank you for inviting me. It was really a privilege to be able to share and encourage people.
All right, everybody, we've made it through this episode. Thank you so much for hanging out and joining me for this episode. So everybody, if you have follow-up questions to this and would like to let me know, go over to fearcastpodcast.com and you can submit a question link there, or just click on the link there and send me that message. Just let me know what your thoughts were, what was helpful, what was not helpful, what was helpful for you in dealing with Christmas time, the stresses and struggles that come up during the season, and I'd love to add those or tag those onto a future episode. But and if you have any specific question for Mitzi, I'm sure she'd be more than happy to jump on a future episode to answer those questions directly. So if you want to get or learn a little bit more about her, I'll add some of her links to her book and to her blog over at fearcastpodcast.com, or the episode page to this episode. And follow her follow her blog. She's got a ton of great information up there and is incredibly helpful. So everybody, please remember that the Fearcast is not a substitute for psychotherapy. If you have questions about how to get started or need a little bit more support in treatment, go over to fearcastpodcast.com and click on the Find Help link, and there's going to be some info for you there. So until next time, take a risk, challenge yourself, and don't take your brain too seriously. Bye.